a Larry Crawford video? First, I'm going to deal with the topic of his character, and I'm going to basically rely upon this FBI report of an interview with Gail Ann Cascadden, Larry's cousin, Larry's 17-year-old cousin. Reading from that report, in summing up her impressions of Crawford, Mrs. Cascadden said he was nuts, and he made her puke. She elaborated on this characterization by stating that Crawford was obviously of below-average mentality, unreliable and unpredictable. He was a loner, drifted around the country from job to job, had no close friends or associates. He reportedly received an undesirable discharge from the United States Army. He was conceited and frequently bragged of his muscular strength and his excellent physique. He claimed to have an extensive knowledge of judo. To support this latter claim, on occasions he would use a judo chop, striking object with heel of hand while fingers are extended and hand held stiff on the interior wall of a house to show the power of this blow. He told Mrs. Cascadden's mother that by continuously snapping his finger on a certain spot on a woman's breast, he could cause the woman so much pain that she would beg him to kill her rather than be further tortured. Mrs. Cascadden further stated that Crawford was oversexed and she never liked to be alone with him. He always wanted to put his hands on her body, smell of her hair, like Brandon, and try to kiss her, despite the fact that she and Crawford were first cousins. At times, Crawford would say he got the spirit so bad that he had to pick up the Bible and read from it. On such occasions, he would read in a mumbling fashion, and what he read could not be completely understood by persons listening to him. This conduct on his part was not ostensibly in jest, but suggested religious fanaticism to Mrs. Cascadden. In Mrs. Cascadden's opinion, Crawford exhibited an indifferent attitude toward the assassination of the president. While Crawford was visiting Mrs. Cascadden's parents in Harrison on November 26 to 27, 1963, a considerable amount of time was being devoted by the television networks to the assassination and its aftermath involving Ruby's murder of Lee Harvey Oswald. Mrs. Cascadden, her parents, and her brothers spent most of their time watching programs on television pertaining to the assassination. Crawford seemed mildly interested in these reports and spent some time upstairs reading comic books. This seemed strange to Mrs. Cascadden. She thought that Crawford should have had an avid, continuing interest in this matter because he was a buddy and former employee of Ruby. In Mrs. Cascadden's vernacular, Crawford seemed about as disturbed over the president's assassination as he would be over killing a cat. Mrs. Cascadden advised that neither she nor her parents could understand why Crawford departed from Dallas to hitchhike back to Michigan on the day following the assassination. Specifically, she asked Crawford why he left Dallas at that time, and he never answered her question. As she recalls, he merely shifted the conversation to another topic. 2. Her parents had been unable to secure an answer to this question from Crawford. Why Crawford would not furnish a reason or reasons for this action is unknown to Mrs. Cascadden. In respect to his departure from Dallas on November 23, 1963, Crawford stated that he did not contact tell Ruby he was leaving. At that time, Ruby owed him wages and Crawford did not attempt to collect them. Crawford explained that he did not mention the departure to Ruby because he and Ruby were buddies and Ruby would not want him to leave. There's also a letter that Crawford wrote to his cousin, Gail, that I've just been reading from, and this confirms what she said. It's a love letter to his 17-year-old first cousin. And also, dealing with Crawford's character, he was serving in the military from September 18th, 1958 to November 10th, 1959, general discharge under honorable conditions, not eligible for reenlistment, discharged per AR 635-200 STN 264. Whatever that is, this is not explained explicitly, but it sounds as if he had some kind of personality problem. And that problem probably deals with his sexuality, I think, based on the information read already. And also, he has a record of bringing a minor across state lines with no further information on that. But it seems to me that Crawford probably has some sexual impulses which he does not control well and which are not in line with community standards. And that would make him ripe for exploitation. I have no evidence that he was exploited, but the intelligence agencies are famous for their sexual blackmail techniques. And this person, if they thought he was useful, could probably be exploited in that way. And now to the story at hand. This is from the November 29th FBI report of an interview with Crawford. During August 1963, he started to work with a carnival and followed this work, which accounted for his being at the Texas State Fair in Dallas, Texas, on or about October 15, 1963. He joined a carnival show which was named How Hollywood Makes Movies. This was run by Bob Craven of Hollywood, California, and he performed the duties of a roustabout. He lived in a tent on the fairgrounds and stayed with this show and another show, which was a rock and roll outfit, until the fair closed on approximately October 30th, 1963. These dates aren't quite right, but I'll get back to that. And the guy he worked for, Craven, was interviewed by the FBI, and that report says Craven recalled that they hired Larry Crawford when he came to their show requesting a job. He said Ruby did not know Crawford prior to the time he was hired by Craven, but that he had met Crawford during the fair. He said that he had no reason to question Crawford's activities in any way while he was employed by them. So Craven knows Ruby, and Craven says Ruby doesn't know Crawford until Ruby meets Crawford at the fair. That is the official story, and that is what all of the evidence says. And this is an important point in the story. The point is that Ruby met Crawford at the fair. He didn't know him before he met him at the fair. That's important because it implies that there's no involvement with a conspiracy, that it's just this random sort of encounter. If, however, Ruby had known Crawford before the fair, then that might imply Crawford is involved in some kind of conspiracy. And also on this point of whether or not he knew Jack Ruby prior to the fair, we have Crawford repeatedly saying in his Warren Commission, in one way or another, that he worked for Ruby for a period of 6 to 8 weeks. But if you look at the dates of the fair up until the day of the assassination, if the official story is true, Crawford could only have worked for Ruby for a period of 4 weeks and 6 days. So, however, the 6 to 8 weeks would cover the period of the fair. So it seems to be that Crawford has in his mind that his employment with Jack Ruby included the time period of the state fair, even though that clearly is not what he says, and that is not the official story. Still, he seems to think it's 6 to 8 weeks, and that would imply he was working for Jack Ruby at the time of the fair, which is not the official story. According to the FBI report from November 29th, Larry said his job at the Carousel Club consisted of being a handyman, cleanup man, part-time bartender, and also answering the telephone. It was his duty to take down names and addresses of people calling the club for Ruby. Ruby ran an ad almost every day in the local paper for waitresses and performers. He also had financial interest in the Twistboard Company at Fort Worth, Texas. Telephone calls in a number of 20 to 40 would be received daily, and these calls were placed in a stenographer's notebook, which he kept on Ruby's desk. So all the evidence shows that it was a very important part of his job to answer the telephone. But Andy Armstrong, who also worked for Jack Ruby, I don't think I'll read this here, but clearly he thinks that Larry wasn't very useful. He didn't do a whole lot of anything. Usually, what did he do? Usually he read books. At the bottom there is what Armstrong says. So, but we do know that Larry did do something, and that was answer the phone for Jack Ruby, and he kept a notebook, so we know he did that. And that is mentioned in the November 29th FBI report. Back to that here. The only odd incident concerning telephone calls was that about 3 or 4 times a day during the time he was at the club, a call would come in and the man would ask if Mr. Ruby was there. If Ruby was not there, the man refused to leave his name, and on every occasion during this period of time, it was the same person who called. He brought this to Ruby's attention on numerous occasions, and Ruby told him to forget about it. However, Ruby was not alarmed. And it does not say explicitly here, but it is implied that if Ruby was there when he called, that Ruby would take the call, even though that is not said. So we've got somebody, the same person, during this time just before the assassination, calling Ruby every day and refusing to leave his name or a message other than that he called. And Mr. Griffin of the Warren Commission brought this up in their voluminous interview with Crawford. Yesterday afternoon, as Mr. Crawford and I were returning from lunch, he indicated to me that he had received some telephone calls at the Carousel Club in the week before President Kennedy was killed from a man who would call 2 or 3, perhaps more times a day, but would not leave his name, but simply ask for Jack Ruby. In connection with that conversation, Mr. Crawford asked me if we had any recordings of Lee Oswald's voice. Mr. Crawford indicated that he would like to listen to these recordings, with the possibility that he might recognize the voice of somebody he had talked to or overheard when he was in Ruby's employ. We have located a tape recording of an interview which was conducted with Mr. Oswald in New Orleans shortly after he was arrested for disturbing the peace in connection with the Fair Play for Cuba activities. The tape recording was made by radio station WDSU New Orleans on August 21st, 1963. The recording involves Lee Harvey Oswald, Carlos Bringuier, Ed Butler, and Bill Stuckey. The recording is provided to us by the United States Secret Service. Notice that we don't get to see the dialogue in which Mr. Crawford brought up this question, but Griffin says that coming back from lunch with Mr. Crawford, that Crawford said all this. Okay, we believe you, Mr. Griffin. And of course, Crawford says that Oswald's voice is not the same voice that called Ruby in the week prior to the assassination. Definitely not. And, well, who thought it was? I don't know. But this was dealt with in the November 29th FBI report. So probably, I think, Mr. Griffin realized that this had to be addressed, or maybe it was his boss who told him it had to be addressed because it's on the record in the FBI report. We have to establish that wasn't Oswald. And that's what this establishes, that wasn't Oswald. That is, if you believe the show they're putting on. And this, along with everything else in the Crawford interview, is buried in a snow job. And by snow job, I mean this is an incredibly huge deposition. It's 290 pages. This has got to be one of the largest depositions taken. There's no way you're going to find anything in there unless you read the whole thing, and you're not going to recognize anything as important unless you already know what's important. So this is a very difficult thing for the casual reader to make any sense of. So of course I can't prove anything here, but I'm very suspicious that Larry Crawford was hired by the conspiracy, and it was done in such a way to hide the fact that he was hired by the conspiracy, and that his job was to take the calls so that none of the locals would hear Oswald's voice, only the person they knew they could depend upon, because he's a sexual pervert, and they've probably got something on him where they could lock him up for the rest of his life, so they know they can depend upon him to say what they need him to say. And what they needed him to say was that was not Oswald's voice on the telephone that kept calling Jack Ruby the week before the assassination. I wish I could prove it, but that's just my suspicion.